This is Jeremy. Welcome to Eighthworld. Good day, everybody. This is Jeremy. Welcome to Eighthworld. It is midday on July 19th, 2020. I hope you are all doing well. Today, I am going to give you another top 10 plus list. This time around, it will be books that I discovered in college that have helped shape me as a reader and a writer and as a thinker, as with the other lists. Also, as with the other lists, this will be in no particular order. I also wish to preface my list by perhaps giving myself a little bit of a pat on the back. I finally succeeded in selling a story. My first story that I wrote and completed, entitled The Night Clerk, a dark fantasy reimagining of my current ER job, was recently accepted by Bards and Sages Quarterly. I'll include a link to them in the episode description so that you can check them out and show them some love. I am ecstatic that I finally got a story accepted, and it is a tremendous confidence boost and proof to me that I might be able to pull off this whole writer thing after all. Now, anyway, to step into a book that has a lot of personal connections for me. Number one on my list is Hyperion by Dan Simmons. I went to the same undergraduate college as Dan Simmons, Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana, which is a unique place. I'll leave it at that. But I received the same sort of education that he did, which is an interesting trait to have in common with a writer that you look up to, and also in his works when he makes references back to his time at Wabash, such as in the Hyperion books. There is a planet with a community called Crawford on it that is an ocean of cornfields with an old college that he describes in the same way that one might describe Wabash itself. Those are nice little tidbits to pick out of a story. Little inside references and jokes that not very many people reading the books would pick up on. Hyperion is an amazing science fiction achievement. It is one of those books that I've read multiple times, and not to sound like an underachiever to my fellow readers, but I'm not the sort that actually reads a lot of books more than once. Being as there are so many out there that warrant reading, I try not to bog myself down, even if I really enjoy a book, by reading it more than once. But there are some exceptions that I've made. I've both read and listened to Hyperion on audiobook several times, and I have to say that it's one of my absolute favorite novels of all time, let alone works of science fiction. It's basically a sci-fi reimagining of the Canterbury Tales in a way. You have a group of pilgrims who are on a journey to the distant world of Hyperion to meet this dark demigod called the Shrike, and each of them is prepared to ask it a question about humanity's future and survival, and any or all of them might die along the way. They've already accepted this, and to pass the time on their journey, they all share their backstories of what led them to this moment. And you have a handful of vastly different science fiction stories, all contained within one under this single title. From the soldier's story of Colonel Fedmon Kassad and his battle through time, through combat simulations, across wars across multiple worlds. You have the scholar's tale. You have a child aging backwards. You have the detective's story about an artificial man trying to solve his own murder. You have the poet's story, talking about the earliest settlement of Hyperion by humanity and of what the Shrike might truly be, of what the Shrike represents. Hyperion, like many books I think on this list, loses something if you delve too deeply into descriptions of it, and all of its pieces form a lovely, cohesive whole by the end. If you've never read Hyperion and you enjoy science fiction, I think that it deserves a place on your bookshelf. Number 2 on my list was a book that I discovered in an eco-lit course that I took my senior year, Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey. I care a great deal about the environment, but that is not necessarily the entire reason why I found a kindred spirit in Edward Abbey. Edward Abbey was a man who had difficulty finding a place in the world, especially in the quote-unquote civilized, urbanized eastern half of the country. He always felt more at home out in the open deserts of the western United States and would bounce between university teaching gigs and going out and working as a park ranger out in Utah, for example, where he collected the experiences and material for Desert Solitaire working at Arches National Park, and just his observations of the natural world combined with his own experiences as a scholar, as a man willing to look beneath the outer veneer of the world and see how it is ugly and see how it is destroying itself, and realizing ultimately through trial and error his powerlessness to prevent that in many instances, and how he simply wished to soak up as much experience of it as he could before it was too late. I, more and more the older I get, really identify with Edward Abbey just from those beliefs that he espoused in his work. I can't say that I would agree with all of his calls to eco-terrorism at times, but I can understand where he was coming from. In my daily life, there's people you meet, people you deal with who have no idea what the world is really like, despite having lived in it for so long and accomplished so many things. They're so tied up in their own selfish wants, desires, their own accomplishments, their own quest for wealth, that they would gladly watch the world burn for everyone else. And I think that that is a great and terrible thing to oppose. And Edward Abbey was kind of an early champion of that. And I hope that I didn't go off tangentially from that too far, but that might not have been Abbey's intention with his work, but that's certainly how it came to rest in my mind. And I thank him for it. Number 3 and number 4 will both be works by Haruki Murakami, who I was first exposed to in college in a science fiction course. Probably my favorite English course of all time. So number 3 on the list, I would say, would be Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, the first Murakami book that I ever read. I've read several since then. I have a bunch more that I want to read. Haruki Murakami is a vast writer, is probably the safest way to say it. His drawing upon both Western and Japanese culture and folklore and art creates this odd amalgamation that has always worked for him. In a way, his naturalistic view of the world lends itself so nicely to the fantastical and science fiction aspects that he works into his stories, so much so that it becomes easy to forget that they're there and just accept them as normal. And I find that to be his great masterstroke of his work. He can make someone a science fiction fan without them even realizing it or without them even having that label in mind. Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World is a dual-layered story about cyberpunk topics of data crunching and entering artificial worlds, and from there it also touches upon ancient mythological Japan and how aspects of it still exist beneath the ground in Tokyo even today, with creatures such as the turtle-like kappa living in deep caves beneath it, and how there is almost this war between the new cyber future of the world and the ancient mythical monsters and heroes that once walked the world. It's a difficult story to explain, as most Murakami is, I think, in short form. So, needless to say, this is another one that deserves a spot on your bookshelf. Now, number 4, as I said, is another Haruki Murakami work. This one is a book of short stories called After the Quake. It is a short collection of stories all based around the Kobe earthquake, I believe, in the early 90s in Japan. Each story follows a different lead into examining different aspects of it. All are somewhat fantastical in ways, some of them much more nuanced than others, but everything you can imagine gets worked into these stories, from a boy who believes that he's the son of God to a giant talking superhero frog. It is one of my absolute favorite short story collections, of which I do have several, but this is at the top of the list. This and probably something like Bloodchild by Octavia Butler, or Civil War Land in Bad Decline by George Saunders. This is comparable to those, if you're familiar with those. So, again, I give it the stamp of approval and suggest you get it for your own bookshelf. Really, anything by Haruki Murakami is worth reading. He has a unique touch to his work that I have never found in another writer. And I don't know if you'll find this to be off-putting or endearing of his work, but I once drew an odd parallel between him and Kevin Smith. And that's not to say that, Kevin Smith's sense of humor is present in Murakami's work, but Murakami's way of looking at people who maybe don't fit into the world and aren't successful despite being otherwise decent and intelligent people. I know that that's an odd reading of Kevin Smith's work, but that's something that I see in both Murakami and Kevin Smith, so if you're a fan of one, check out the other. The next work on my list, number 5, is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. This is another book that I've read a couple of times that has stuck with me. Cormac McCarthy is really best known for his westerns, or for more so his deep, dark, existential, postmodern in a way, westerns. The Road is unique in his body of work because it is a post-apocalyptic story told about a father and son simply trying to survive in a dying Earth. The disaster that leads to the situation is hinted at but never fully described or named. It is left up to the reader to decide for themselves what it was, I believe, whether it was a nuclear war or a caldera exploding in the middle of the country or an asteroid striking the Earth. It could be any of those things. It's never made clear. But what McCarthy does here is shed light on the ugliness of humanity in this world-ending crisis. Rather than coming together and trying to survive, people become monsters for the most part. But not entirely. There are some good people left. Despite the fact that the world is dying and that there is no avoiding the fact that it is dying, there are good people left, doing good things as they should, simply because they are the right things to do. And I think that that is a great comfort, in a way, despite the ultimate sad tragedy of this story. And The Road does have perhaps one of the most beautiful and heart-wrenching last pages of any book I've ever read, and I don't want to spoil that for you. You should definitely check this one out. The next book on my list is a comic by J. Michael Straczynski, or Joe Straczynski, as he goes by, I believe. You may know the name. He created Babylon 5 back in the 90s. Recently, he was associated with the movie Changeling, directed by Clint Eastwood and starring Angelina Jolie. He also helped create the series Sense8 on Netflix. He's also written a bunch of comics over the years. He had a good run with Marvel for a while. He wrote what is my favorite run on Spider-Man, in fact, back in the early 2000s. But what this is an entirely indie creator-owned comic called Midnight Nation. It's a little hard to find these days. It was out of print for a while. I think it is back in print now if you can find a copy of it. It follows the story of a cop who is injured and dies in the line of duty, and who travels across a forgotten America that exists beneath the surface veneer of the world with a woman named Laurel, and he is faced with the ugliness of humanity and also the monstrousness of what comes in the hereafter on this journey. And by the end of the story, he is forced to make a tremendous choice out of love. And there's so much going on in this that, again, I don't want to give too much detail and risk spoilers, because so much is going on, it's not worth spoiling it because of how all the pieces fit together. Suffice it to say that there are angels and devils and God and Satan and human beings lost in the shuffle throughout this story. And in fact, one of the best speeches in a comic book ever given is given by Lucifer in this story. And what you are shown in the character of the main character by the end is a reinvigorating celebration of what it means to be a human being. This might be the pinnacle of J. Michael Straczynski's work, and if you're a fan of his writing as I am, trust me, this is worth your time. It is probably in my top 5 comics of all time. It's something that I deeply love. There'll be other comics on this list, of course, toward the end, but a lot of them I've already named in previous episodes, and I don't want to bog down future lists by listing a lot of the same things, so I'll come back to them at the end as bonuses. Next up on the list is a Stephen King work, a nonfiction work, a book that every writer or aspiring writer should check out at some point on writing. It is Stephen King's Memoir of the Craft, as its subtitle says, his memories looking back on his early struggles as a writer, considering his successes, and offering advice and encouraging words to anyone wanting to follow the same path. One of the parts that stuck with me, even now, years after having read it, is when Carrie, his first novel, was bought. It was bought for a tremendous amount during the era in which it was published, several $100,000, I believe, and how he fainted on the phone when he got the call from his agent and woke up on the floor still holding the phone. I have to say I would be in the same position if such happened to me. Next up is another Stephen King work, It. I know that it has gone through some recent movie adaptations and some older miniseries film adaptations as well, but none of it has truly captured the deep spirit of this book. It is a great example of Stephen King's manic cosmic genius, something that makes him a worthy successor to a writer such as H.P. Lovecraft, but also a master in his own right in this cosmological domain that he creates. Because even beyond the surface level visceral horror, even beyond the monster story presented by Pennywise, the cosmic spider being, there's an entire other layer to the universe and to the multiverse that Stephen King plays with here that you begin to see taking shape in his other works as well. And this is an excellent example of how works such as his Dark Tower series came into being and how they extend across his entire body of work. It has some of the most disturbing scenes of any of his books that I've read, but it also has some of the most heart-wrenching scenes. And oddly enough, much like The Road by McCarthy, it has a beautiful ending that sticks with you long after you close the book. And I think that you should follow through with this book, and it is a tremendous book, very long. I think that you should follow through just to get that entire picture that the movies let down a bit. Next up on my list is The Years of Rice and Salt by Kim Stanley Robinson. It was a toss-up between this and Red Mars by Robinson. Both are excellent books that I read during college on professorial suggestion. Red Mars I studied in the same science fiction course as Haruki Murakami and several others on this list. But The Years of Rice and Salt really stuck with me because it's a more fantastical story that the basis of it is, what if the Black Death had actually wiped out basically 99% of the people in Europe, and you only have a few small pockets of Europeans here and there, such as in island communities that survived the Black Death, and European domination never happened, and you have a world that develops underneath the Chinese and the world of Islam as the dominant cultures on the planet. You have entirely different outcomes to world events, and you have some technological advances coming more quickly, some coming more slowly, but humanity maintains its central shape in a strange way. And with that, you also have a cast of characters who are bound together through this oath to the Buddha to be born together in each era after each era. So you have, a handful of characters whose names always begin with the same letter, but they're different names, and they eventually interact in their lifetimes and bring about great change. And it's interesting seeing world events through these lenses of these different people who are all the same people. You have a world war fought between the Islamic world and the Chinese. You have the Chinese discovering the Americas first, and how they accidentally introduced smallpox to Native Americans, but instead of weaponizing it, they taught them how to survive it, and how Native American nations survived into what would be, a contemporary age compared with where we are now, and how democracy still sprang up amongst Native American tribes in North America, becoming somewhat like the United States in spirit. It's interesting, the historical threads that Kim Stanley Robinson draws throughout this story, and I loved reading it again. Like everything else, I'm a broken record with this, but this deserves a read and it deserves a place on your bookshelf. I would consider a lot of these to be essential reading for science fiction and fantasy fans, especially. Somewhat obscure works and older works, to be sure, but worth keeping in the back of your mind as part of the larger body within these genres. So the last entry on this list, and an entry that such a list might not be complete without, is a work by Philip K. Dick, and for this one I chose Ubik. Ubik is a difficult story, and for me it holds a lot of symbolism as well, because it was a book that I was reading in that science fiction course in college that I've mentioned several times already, and it was also one that I was reading when a dear friend, an old teacher who was like a second father to me, passed away. And the professor who was teaching this science fiction course also died a couple of years ago. So these books, especially this one, carry a lot of finality in an odd way to them. They stand in my mind as testaments to the influences that great teachers have had on me. And Ubik, especially among Philip K. Dick's work, makes a reader question the world around him or her. It's unclear whether or not a simulation or what we think of as the real world is actually the real world. It's unclear whether somebody who is put into cryosleep and put into a simulation is alive or dead, or both, or neither, or whether their world is more real than ours because of the mental powers that they are able to exercise in these realms. It really makes you question the universe around you quite a bit, and not just in these playful ways, but truly makes you wonder what is worth pursuing and what is ultimately real in ways that might make some people uncomfortable. And we also, in this class, read The Man in the High Castle and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the latter of which was the basis for Blade Runner, a great science fiction film classic. And all of Philip K. Dick's work looks at the world around us and also who we are, and makes us question what is real, what's real for us, and what is ultimately correct in the cosmic structure of things. And it's not an easy answer, ever. And I don't know if that's a satisfying description of this book, but I don't know how else to talk about it, because I think that you leave the book having read it with more questions than you came into it with. What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be real? What does it mean to have power? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be dead? What's the real world, and is all of that relative to where you are at any time? Anyway, I hope that I haven't blown your minds too much with all of these, but this is the kind of stuff that I read in college, both for fun and for classes. I don't regret those experiences at all. I have enjoyed all these books on this list, and on my others as well, but this is a list of books that helped shape my thinking into my adulthood. And I wanted to share them with you. And I would love to have conversations about any of these books if you've read them. And I hope that you'll take my recommendations at face value and try some of them out yourself if you haven't. Now, I promised a few bonuses, but truly, they're entries from other lists. This is also the era in which I read The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, and also Watchmen and V for Vendetta by Alan Moore. So you can kind of look at those as being influential works upon my thinking in this era as well. I did my best not to discriminate against anything in this era in my reading. I was hungry for knowledge, hungry for insight, and I went after it. This was the era when I was watching Battlestar Galactica on TV every week and going to the movies at the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I was just grabbing up stories left and right, hungry for them. And at times I miss that freedom to constantly be taking in stories, and I have tried my best to recapture that. And if there's nothing else that you take from this list, let it be a little advice. Make time for stories, make time for consuming them. Let your heart be filled with them, and then look at the world around you through them. Learn from them. Eighthworld Podcast is, and always shall be, partnered with and sponsored by Misplaced Muse Creative, a wonderful source of bookish gifts, wax goods, and hot beverages. Be sure to check out the episode description for links to their social media. Be sure to give them a like and a follow, and check out their catalog of goods, and be sure to give me a like and a follow as well. Be sure to leave a comment below if you enjoyed my work or want to discuss any of the books that I've mentioned. Is there anything that I've forgotten that you think is essential that would fit the theme of this list? Or anything that you're curious about that you would like to ask me about? I am always open to discussion about books I enjoy, or stories that I enjoy in general. Thanks, as always, for listening. I appreciate you all, and here's to a bright future. Be sure to mask up when you go out, be sure to be responsible, and I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Be safe.